This Week in IT. Nvidia is about to crash the Windows on Arm party. Its first PC chips could arrive with a new build of Windows 11 that's just for new silicon. At the same time, Mandiant is making it trivial to crack a decades-old protocol that some organizations are still using. And a new class of AI bugs show how MCP servers can be turned into cloud credential vending machines. So stay tuned for all of the latest news. Welcome to This Week in IT, the show where I talk about everything connected to Azure, Microsoft 365 and Windows. Today's episode is sponsored by our friends at Caresoft. As we've talked about on this channel before, Microsoft and Qualcomm are planning to ship a new generation of chips and Surface devices later this year, which will be the Copilot Plus PCs that are specially designed to run AI tasks locally on the device. Now, we've already had one generation of these machines 2 years ago, which were based on the new Snapdragon X processors, and Intel came into that as well and produced some processors that also had NPU units, and you had the choice essentially to choose between Arm, which has some compatibility issues with hardware and software, but runs really great, especially off battery, or you could choose the Intel variant, essentially the x86 variant, which had improved power efficiency and better performance and this NPU, but still didn't really perform as well as the ARM chips when you take away that power supply. Now, there have been some reports coming through that supply chain information shows that Nvidia is going to start shipping its own ARM-based chips for PCs. This first generation of chips are apparently going to be called the N1X, and they could ship as early as the end of the first quarter this year to coincide with these new devices and a special build of Windows 11 26H1, which you're only going to get if you buy new hardware. There are no new features. It's specifically to support this new generation of AI chips. Now, Nvidia's architecture for this chip is apparently based on something that they already produce called DGX Spark. Now, the architecture of these DGX Spark chips is essentially an ARM-based CPU, a Blackwell GPU, and it all sits on a Grace Blackwell system on a chip with 128 gigabytes of unified memory. So the design is very similar to the system on a chip that you're essentially getting with Qualcomm Snapdragon chips. So this is interesting from the perspective of up until now, we've only really had Qualcomm seriously playing in the Windows on ARM space. And with a second vendor coming in, this is obviously going to change potentially the availability, the pricing of these devices going forwards. Hopefully we'll see more of this second generation of Copilot Plus PCs going into the marketplace. So there's more incentive for vendors to create software that runs natively on these devices without having to use the emulation layer, which obviously slows everything down to a certain extent if you don't have a native build of those applications. There have also been long-standing rumors that AMD will also be producing an ARM-based, assume system on a chip as well for Windows-based PCs. As far as I know, there's still no actual product in the market or official announcement from AMD, but this space is hotting up, and hopefully we'll see more big players come into this space this year and next year. And I really hope that Windows gets pushed towards this AMD platform. If Intel can't match the performance of these devices with ARM-based processors off battery, then I think it's going to be a problem for Intel going forwards. Of course, what Intel has at the moment is that broad compatibility that the ARM-based devices cannot match, but hopefully that will change, much as we've seen happen with the Apple devices. It's a bit different in that ecosystem, of course, because everything gets pushed to ARM because that's what Apple decides. But in the Windows ecosystem, Microsoft doesn't necessarily decide, well, tomorrow all devices have to be running ARM, because obviously that's not the values that Windows is built on. It's all built on the idea of backwards compatibility. And of course, enterprises require that, so they can't just do what Apple did. But hopefully we'll see these ARM-based chips become more and more popular as time goes on. Let me know what you think about these new generation of chips that are coming for Windows on ARM. Personally, I've held off buying a Windows on ARM device because I think the devices that are going to be released this year are likely to set the baseline minimum for any AI features that Microsoft releases for the next few years, and because of the hopefully dramatically better GPU performance that they should bring. But let me know, is your organization planning to invest in these devices, or are there still questions about compatibility? Before I go on to the next story, I've got a quick favor to ask you. About 60% of the people who watched last week's video weren't subscribed to the channel. Now, as we go live today, we're on about 13,913 subscribers. I'd love it if we could push that up to 14,000 this week. So if you'd like to see these weekly news updates from Petri.com, please subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell notification to make sure that you don't miss out on the latest uploads. This week, Mandiant released pre-computed rainbow tables that would make it really easy for a hacker to crack Microsoft's NTLM version 1 protocol. Now, this is something that Microsoft has been urging you to switch off if you're still relying on that in your organization, anything. If I remember correctly, newer versions of Windows 10 and 11 come with it disabled by default. But of course, it might be that in some organizations, there are still applications that rely on that. So these rainbow tables are essentially big databases of passwords and hashes that make it easier for hackers to crack a particular protocol, in this case, NTLM version 1, without having to use brute force attacks. So they would be able to decode that protocol much faster than if they didn't have this pre-built table. So why on earth would Mandiant release this? They're a security company. Their main goal is to keep companies secure and not to make it easier for hackers, yeah? So essentially, this is a little bit of tough love from Mandiant. They're saying, look, if you haven't already done it, you should have disabled NTLM version 1 in your organization. So if you haven't done that, you need to switch on auditing. You need to find out what applications are still relying on NTLM version 1, and you need to either isolate them or upgrade them. I know that's not always an easy thing to do, but it's going to become easier for hackers to now decode any passwords that still rely on that protocol. So you need to get some strategy in place to either isolate it or to get rid of it completely. Mandiant is saying that all you would need is around $600 of consumer hardware and probably less than 12 hours once you've got your hands on this pre-computed rainbow table to crack NTLM version 1. Now, if you need to look at your NTLM policies there, you'll find them in Active Directory and Windows Server. So you need to go and look to see what they're set at and make sure that that is hopefully not being used, and make sure you plug that hole in your organization's security. Back to artificial intelligence, and researchers have highlighted 3 vulnerabilities in Anthropic's Git MCP server. Now, an MCP server is essentially a little bit like a middleman that allows you to use natural language queries, which get sent to the MCP server, and they convert it into a language that the API for Git can understand. So it's like a translator, if you like. Now, these MCP servers have become available for many, many different services and platforms over the last couple of years. And because they're so widespread now, hackers are looking at them as a potential way to get into an organization. Can they find any credentials or information that might be really useful in an attack? So these 3 CVEs are essentially remote code execution vulnerabilities in injection paths, and they can essentially allow an attacker to run remote code on a device that they don't actually have permission to access. They also highlighted a server-side request forgery bug in Microsoft's Markdown MCP server. So this is not something that's isolated at the moment to Anthropic's Git MCP server, and I suspect we're going to see a lot more of these vulnerabilities being discovered by researchers as we go forward, and there's going to be a bigger discussion about how to secure these MCP MCP servers in practice. Now, the researchers did note that the MCP servers, for Marketdown, that Microsoft supplies, when they're running on Amazon Web Services with the instance metadata service running version 1, the instance metadata service essentially holds all of the important information for a virtual instance of a service or a virtual machine, information like its IP address, its network name, and running version 1 of that service allows a hacker to get information extracted from that metadata service and potentially then hack the MCP server that's running on top of the instance. So you can upgrade to version 2 of that service, would help to make those MCP servers for Marketdown more secure. So there are various other things that you can do to help secure MCP servers. So you, of course, could audit the MCP servers that you're using, create sandbox tools for execution. So that's a little bit like what Microsoft is hoping to build into Windows 11. Of course, restrict metadata access, so make sure you upgrade to version 2 of the instance metadata service if you're using AWS, and of course make sure that you get any patches installed that have been released by the vendor. These MCP servers are coming up everywhere to do all sorts of things, so you need to make sure that you're auditing any use of them in your organization. If you found the information in this video useful, I'd really appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up, because it helps to grow the channel on YouTube. I'm going to leave you with another video on the screen about a security update that is adding bulk to the Windows 11 install and potentially making Windows a little bit slower than it has been in the past. So do check that out. I'd like to thank again our sponsors of today's episode, Caresoft. But that's it from me for this week, and I'll see you next time.